Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sharon Reed and I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator for the Hood Museum of Art. And I'd like to welcome you today to our virtual gallery talk, Landscaped, Modern Photography and the Environment. We have launched a poll and we ask you to please respond as you can. We'll close the poll shortly. This just helps us determine how we can best reach audiences with what's happening at the museum. There will be tips and housekeeping information entered into the chat box for your convenience. And if you have any questions, just enter it into the chat. If you have questions about the presentation and the program and don't want to forget them before the Q&A, please feel free to pop them anytime into the Q&A box, which we will monitor, and then we will answer as many questions as we can when we get to the Q&A portion of the program. And now I'm happy to introduce you all to Virginia Rice Kelsey 1961S Director John Stomberg.
Hello, thank you, Sharon. Welcome, it's great to be here. Just a couple of a preamble, if you will. This was designed to, in a way, virtually replicate a gallery talk, which is a very particular kind of talk where we would, in a relatively small group, wander the gallery, look at photographs together, and engage in a more conversational dialogue rather than a lecture format. So I'm trying to recreate that digitally. So I'm going to talk largely about themes and not lecture about history and so forth. I'm happy to answer specific questions. And if I don't know the answers, I'll just make it up. No, I will do my best to answer specific factual questions, but the goal is to have a more open-ended conversation about the themes that landscape photography can bring up. And then a public service announcement for those of you who haven't heard, the museum will be open to the public again as of August 4th. So after August 4th, we look forward to welcoming you back. Unfortunately, the show I'm talking about today will no longer be on view. It's been on view since the winter, and it's been our students who have had access to it. So I'm giving you a gallery talk of a show that you will most likely have missed, and so I wanted you to have an opportunity to see it. Please feel free to ask questions. Sharon will get them to me if I'm otherwise occupied. This is one of 7 shows that features gifts, both past, present, and future, from the family of Jane and Raphael Bernstein. I'm forever grateful to them for their continuous support of the Hood Museum of Art, all that they have done, the work that they do for us. And I'm thrilled to be featuring some of the works that will be coming to the Hood Museum today from them. So let me start with a slightly surprising slide for a photography talk. Paintings. But I do this on purpose. I wanted to start by saying, if we look at these 2 paintings, the choices of the artist become pretty clear pretty fast. When we look at paintings, we think a lot, we're much more accustomed to thinking about what is the artist doing. And on the left, you can see Thomas Cole. It's an undisturbed landscape. We see a storm on the distance. It's Lake George. It's practically uninhabited, wild wilderness. This is a really typical Hudson River School painting where the United States is presented as a kind of new Eden, and it's pristine and uninhabited, by the way, even though, of course, Lake George was long inhabited by Native Americans. That wasn't the goal of this picture, but rather to show this garden of earthly delights here in upstate New York. On the right is an unusual painting, actually, because it shows a tannery, a factory, and it's, you know, downright unpretty, pardon my lack of gracious language there, but you know, the trees are torn down, it's kind of a mess, and probably fairly accurate. This artist seems to be like saying, this is what the landscape often really does look like. And so we're going to focus on that kind of difference in the landscape between what is really there and what is the artist trying to get at with their photographs. So we've broken it up into several sections, and these are fun and not exclusive. So fun and not exclusive is key here. But I'm just going to start by looking at abstraction and self-expression, and then look at the garden as a landscape, or actually look at the landscape as a garden, and then look at landscaped gardens, and look at the impact that humankind has had on the landscape. And then I'm going to discuss this theme that really comes out in that last painting on the right, the tannery, the idea of the machine in the garden, and how American artists and photographers have dealt with the growing occupation of the landscape. And then finally, I'll wrap up with a kind of very present tense approach to landscape photography, which looks at the garden in demise now, and openly addresses that situation. So let's start with abstraction and self-expression. I'm starting with George Tice, an American photographer, who in this case has closed the lens down, the aperture in his camera down, so he's got a really high contrast. So this is literally as black and white practically as you could get it. And this solitary tree, this anyhow to me is a way for Tice to express feelings of, perhaps loneliness. It's a single tree. It's not a forest. There was a lot of work done in this period where photographers tried to map poetic allusion onto photography, and asked for forgiveness for not giving more details, but hoped that audiences would instead open up to the possibility that looking at a photograph could be a purely emotional experience and not one of data collection. There's an anticipation a lot of times when we look at photography that what we're really there to do is get information. And photographers such as this one in this moment are really asking us to suspend that expectation for data and to enjoy and relish, what this photograph can bring to us. And were we standing in the gallery, this is the moment where I might say to people, like, how do you respond to a photograph like this? What are some of the feelings that it offers to you? So that's where I wanted to start with this part about subjectivity in photography. Focus is often used as a way of indicating a kind of subjective approach, because inherently, if you've got soft focus, you're not trying to give detailed information. You are literally offering non-detailed information. And Hubert Goclès here, a Belgian photographer, is photographing this pool as though they were forms. And at this point, you can almost feel like this is an abstract painting, that this is a composition that somebody might have come up, two geometric forms, this balance of light and dark and soft forms, could be a charcoal drawing. And so I'm deliberately suggesting this elision between media at this part of the conversation to start us out thinking how deliberate photographers really are, and how I'm sure there's accidents, but usually the selection process either discovers an accident that speaks to what they wanted to do, or eliminates the accidents and allows these photographers to articulate more clearly where they're coming from. Here's a Bill Brandt, English photographer, and this practically looks like calligraphy. It's a river with sun on it, again using stark contrast to reduce the gray shades and increase this. When we're looking at Bill Brandt and you're looking at post-war photography, the connection to abstract expressionist painting is not unwarranted. Many of these photographers were interested in trying to find subjective truths rather than objective truths. And throughout Europe and the United States, there was a movement towards what was often called subjective photography, which just turned its back on the need to tell a specific story or report on the war or report on the poor, but rather to do the work that poets do in offering you a conscious and unconscious release from the reality of everyday life. And these photographs sought to operate in these, and these are all in the show. another soft focus image where you get a sort of repeated form and then the long, soft foreground of the ocean. So very, very simple composition, water, mountain, sky, but eloquently formulated, and what is probably a continuation of some degree of influence from Japanese prints, which entered the European market in the 1870s and 1880s, and continued to have a lingering influence on artists throughout the 20th century as they looked to the abstract organization of compositions in Japanese prints and took from that inspiration for their paintings and, in this case, photographs. Brandt was an absolute master of this sort of minimalist approach to evocative photography, giving us just not a lot to work from specifically, but rather giving us allusions to the way we might actually feel were we walking through this particular forest, and emphasizing art not as reading, but as experiencing. And different photographs operate in different ways, but Brent very much wanting us to set back and allow ourselves to focus on what does our experience of this place through the vehicle of this photograph feel like, and how do we arrive at those feelings. Okay, so that was the first opening chapter. And again, this isn't an exhaustive list. This is a list that we have good examples of in this one exhibition, and there are lots of crossovers. But let's move on to the idea of the garden as the landscape, almost the Garden of Eden. And in this Evelyn Hofer beautiful dye transfer print, color print now, of olive trees near Cordoba, Spain. Again, I think that this, even though it's cultivated, it feels so, oops, I'm sorry. It feels as though it was original somehow, this whole thing, although the marks of mankind are here. We're going to get into that much more, looking at the impact of man-made forms on the landscape. This does bring out these beautiful colors, and color photography was quite suspect in 1963. It was still considered, if you wanted to be a serious photographer, you didn't work in color, because that was what advertisers did. They worked in color photography. Artists worked in black and white. So just the fact that she was shooting in color was itself a way of establishing a kind of a new approach. In some ways, a more typical approach to this part, the garden landscape, is this Ray Metzger photograph, where, you know, it could be 1987, 1985 when the photograph could be taken. But if there had been photography, maybe this could have been 1387 or 1587. There's very little sign of industrial revolution or progress. This is really searching out for the inherent forms and mystery of nature, like Elliot Porter, who has built his career in color photography, of seeking out these compositions which seem so carefully construed, but are typically discovered by him on forays into the wildlife. And that puts him in a particular camp. There's all sorts of polarizations we can come up with today: black and white photographer versus color photographer, somebody who's just showing us the marks of mankind on nature, somebody who's not. But another one is that sort of the difference between agrarian and hunter-gatherer, where the agrarian is somebody who sets up a still life in their studio, and you know, the metaphor goes on to grow the picture, versus the hunter-gatherer who wanders the woods looking for the composition thereafter. And Porter has been a tireless hunter-gatherer of fantastic compositions found in nature that really relish these simple moments that go on all the time, all around us, that are just spectacular and life-affirming in a way. And you know, these aren't grandiose landscapes. He, as you can see, calls these intimate landscapes. And by that, I mean, you can think of perhaps a photographer who does a whole mountain range or some vast seascape. And he's focusing in more on these simple little moments and the colors and the arrangements of forms that can allow for joy, actually. And you can think of him as in line with a painter such as Matisse, who's thinking about the pure joy of color and form, and looking for art to be a harmonious and affirmative experience. And then another Metzger, this beautiful landscape, where the decision making becomes a little more clear here, where he's probably got the camera so that the bottom is parallel with sea level, if you will. So he's looking at a mountain. I mean, this photograph could have been very different if he tilted the camera so that he tried to make that line horizontal in the middle. And instead, he has this diagonal line, which gives a lot of energy and motion to the photograph, despite the tree, which seems to be very old and in its own way. And as I get older, I get less interested in this, but showing the wisdom of age, we talk about that, like this tree is showing its age and it's earned every scar. And that is its own way is a kind of a mark of beauty. And the Dutch in the 17th century were particularly good at painting these wonderfully expressive old gnarly trees that just seem to be, the wise elder of the picture. So that kind of brings out this idea of untrammeled landscape. I shouldn't have started with that Hofer, but anyhow, such is life. But that was the untrammeled landscape. And then now I'd like to look at what happens to the garden when humans are let in. And we start seeing the man-altered landscape. And I'm starting with the Stephen Shore photograph from 1974 of Saskatchewan. And we can see the fences and the telephone lines crisscrossing what would otherwise be just this vast wilderness. And Stephen Shore was part of a group that didn't self-identify, but was early identified as being new topographical photographers that focused on the man-altered landscape. And that term came from an exhibition where a very clever curator put together, I don't know, about 8 or 9 photographers whose work looked like landscape photography as it always did at first, but when you look close, you started seeing things like tractor marks or electric lines or fences or evidence of the fact that there was no more untrammeled nature, that we had to own up to the fact that we had changed nature permanently through our presence there. And Stephen Shore was one of the people included in this show. So we kick off this section by looking at his work to bring out the ineffable and unchanging impact of humankind on the landscape. It can be in lovely photographs as well. Here, going back to Bill Bront, you see this gorgeous tree, which has been growing for so long, its branches are coming down on the ground. I don't know this, but there are some trees that actually form a circle around themselves because their branches end up rooting. I don't know if that's going on. But through the fog, you also see this house, right? That's Chiswick House. So we're in a formal garden at Chiswick House. And the British approach to landscape has long been chronicled as a pairing of the old and the new, the built and the unbuilt, the wild and the cultivated. And it's in that tension that most formal British gardens existed. And it actually went so far as to articulate ideas like the beautiful and the role of the sublime in the beautiful. And the sublime in this case was the old-fashioned way of thinking of the sublime. Like we might say, oh, that cocktail was sublime. But, in the 18th century, it had a very particular meaning, which was so full of life and close to death at the same time that it's essentially a spiritual experience. And examples of that were standing by the ocean and listening to the waves crash, standing on a mountaintop, or contemplating our own insignificance. So this would be, a combination of these ideas of the beauty and the sublime. But also age and contemplating, these odes to a past. Here's Hadrian's Wall in England. And so a ruin within the landscape, offering a moment to reflect on civilization's past, civilization's future, life being fleeting. The role of these ruins is always to encourage thoughtfulness. And in here, you can see the trees continue to thrive, even though the road is beginning to fall apart, and likewise the ruins. Nature continues to thrive throughout. And that's a very sobering realization, that we are but briefly here when other things will be here for a very long time, mountains and rivers and so forth. And again, using soft focus often is an approach to creating these. I particularly like this one because it begins to get at the sense of infinity, and using nature as a way of, obviously planted nature, very controlled nature, trees in a canal. So this is all very carefully planted, very carefully landscaped, but to give a particular feeling of of infinity and the infinite. A lot of these landscapes were really meant for us to wander through slowly, perhaps alone, perhaps with a friend, and have a discussion about the big issues in life, the here and the hereafter, how we respond to people. These were meant to be environments in which metaphysical activity would flourish. And the photographs, in this case by Lillian de Kock, is meant to encourage that as well. And then this theme of the mark of man in the landscape, I'm going to use this photograph, also by Lillian de Kock, as a transition, because yes, we have this, there's so many ways to read this picture. So you've got a storm coming, and then you see the windmill, and understand that the windmill will operate faster in the storm, and that we're harnessing that energy into, for our own good. But it is also, an overt sign of our presence in the landscape. You've got the fence and the water holding tank and the windmill, and all of this leads to a problem for artists that's existed since the 19th century, which is where I started with those paintings, which is how do we deal with man's indelible mark on nature through time? And here we have, these are medieval tin mines in Devon in England that have long since stopped being used, since stopped being fruitful, and they're grown over, and yet here they are all these hundreds of years later, still shaping and marking the landscape. So we've made these major tectonic marks on the landscape, and this wasn't in quote unquote natural. This is something that we created. And Marilyn Bridges' Glastonbury tour also brings up these unnatural, but the way that it's been scalloped, the whole landscape has been scalloped and shaped so that the tower here stands out, but also so that the fields can be harvested appropriately and grown and used productively. So in order to use a hill productively, we've had to reshape that hill so that we can grow things on it. And then the last slide in this section is, we see this beautiful landscape, and it might actually take us a minute to find, oh yes, there's like a tent and there's a water wheel here. At first it looks like this bucolic winter landscape. And I have to say, this collection of photographs are filled with this particular subject, this tension between civilization and the wild. And it's a very important subject for landscape photography, and certainly for any philosophy post-industrial age. How we address this is one of our most critical questions: how we deal with the earth as we received it, and how we deal with the earth as we're reshaping it. And so that brings us to a concept that came out from a scholar named Leo Marx, who said that American artists have actually done their best to try and naturalize the machine and the garden. They've done their best to just say, yes, this is our new garden. This is, the factory is natural in this. And sometimes you can see this in compositions where in this case, the smokestack is below the horizon, kind of allowing it to be down in the ground. You can see this photographer, George Tice, has chosen to get up high. I happen to know that spot to take this photograph, but these are decisions. He certainly could have climbed down and taken a very different kind of picture. But in this way, he's suggesting that the factory is inherent to the view that we see, in this case, the Passaic River area of Patterson, that it is a new natural form. It is a new member. It is a new inhabitant of the garden. And these pictures come up a lot. Here's another George Tice, where we seem to be focusing on these mountains, but what you can really see in the background is that support structure. It's basically sort of an inverted bridge that holds these huge power pipes up, probably an oil line or something like that. But 96% of this image is untrammeled nature. But that 4%, and I'm guessing here, by the way, please don't hold me to that, but that 4% that's taken up by those I-beams and by that pipe speak volumes to this tension between the natural and the unnatural. And we have paintings throughout the later 19th century that increasingly include little hints of the encroachment of mankind in the landscape, including, like, sometimes it's a distant train, or in this case, a small bridge. And this is something that landscape photographers choose to show as well. For example, think how different Tice's photograph would be if he turned it just so that the left edge of that rock outcropping was the left edge of the photograph. Then suddenly we're looking at what appears to be a wild rock outcropping covered in trees, and we have no idea where it is. And we're thinking of wilderness rather than of encroachment. And this has been a subject that has been refined throughout the 20th century, so that all sorts of encroachments are sometimes even somewhat celebrated or openly acknowledged. In this case, now we're looking at a 1930s image, and it's got electricity, which in the 1930s was still really new. Rural electrification was an ongoing project. Gasoline, having a car that one could drive around and move. So now we have the landscape and the means for its own demise brought up in the same photograph, because the gasoline will allow you to drive around. The electricity will allow people to live further in more remote areas. I don't really have time to go into it now, but there was also a celebration of technology that lies behind some of these things. For some people, they saw these images as unbridled progress and Americanism and Fordism and mass production at its best, and signs of positive hope for the future. You see 99 million foot-pounds per gallon, bragging about some huge number, this idea that we have infinite potential to power our cars. And this was translated into infinite potential to make canned beans and blue jeans. And so there was often a kind of optimistic tendency to these photographs, and Berenice Abbott tried, I believe, to bring out some of the irony in that. And when you look at her photographs, like, who was really benefiting in the 30s from that kind of optimism? And she focused quite often on the people who didn't benefit directly from those. Again, this old railroad, instead of celebrating the might of the railroad and the promise of the railroad, in this case, she's kind of looking at the irony of that optimism in the 30s, and how the downturn in the economy was making a lie out of some of the promise that they'd seen for technology in the 20s. All of this conversation mapped onto a landscape. So this very much being about that push and pull that Leo Marx talked about when he talked about the machine in the garden. And Margaret Bork-White, also a great observer of rural United States, looking at this kind of wonderful contrast between the Hand Melons farm, which is still extant today, and kind of peaceful fishing, the difference between mass production and the simplification of like just getting your fish you can see for yourself. And finally, this image, before I go to the last two images, by Lillian de Kock, which is a very complicated image at the base of a coma taken in 1970. So we started thinking, when did that wagon arrive at the base of a coma? A coma was one of the few pueblos that was not actually occupied by Euro-American settlers. So what is the meaning of this wagon that's been abandoned in front of this landscape? So to me, I think Lillian de Kock brings up a huge history of American manifest destiny theorizing and following through, and all of the complications and the truth of the devastating impact that Euro-American settlers had on the West, all with one photograph. Again, so allowing this contrast to speak volumes and brings it into a kind of political realm. I'm just going to speed up a little bit because I really want to get to questions. Of course, cityscapes are part of the machine in the garden. They are, in a way, the machine taking over the garden. And we have very different forms of cityscapes present in the exhibition as well as signifiers that read as icons of a place. You know, here we have Goodley, Texas, and Red Oak, Texas, by a photographer who's using the letters, the words, the advertisements as a way of thinking about the dance between direct messaging and the nature that surrounds it. I mean, in this picture, nature continues to be huge. You feel that vast sky and this relatively small attempt in the face of all that to have a coat and dress shop. And then the garden in demise, I bring your attention to the work of Edward Burtynsky, in this case, Shipbreaking in Bangladesh, whose work uses the aesthetics of photographic beauty to attract you in. When we first look at this, we see this beautiful blue, the white, the reflections on the water. It's only after time that we realize how incredibly dirty this all is, and rusty and dangerous. And when we contemplate the people who work there, what their life is like, we see the individual running. You know, he's actually got bare feet. Like, how is this possibly a good thing? And this is repeated in the last photograph in the show. You know, this abstract composition of tires. You know, if you squint your eye, it almost feels like some kind of energetic life form. But upon closer inspection, we realize that this is this huge repository of waste that there is no particularly good way of disposing. And so these sometimes get burnt or metalled or melted or, you know, destroyed in different ways. But Burtynsky is an environmental warrior who uses the aesthetics of photography to help further causes that are of interest to him. And I asked him once, does it bother him that people think of his photographs as beautiful first? And he said, no, absolutely not. That's the hook. You're attracted by the beauty. You're impacted by the content. And that's a place to stop thinking about photography and landscape in modern photography. So now I'll shift over to questions.
Okay, thank you, John, so much. That's wonderful gallery talk. So again, feel free, everyone, to just pop any questions right into the Q&A. We'll read them out as they come to you. John, we have one, like, to start. How did this collection come to be in the Hood Museum of Art?
No, an excellent question. So two people put this collection together, Rafe and Jane Bernstein, Dartmouth parents who have long been interested in museums, and when their son was here, got involved in the Hood Museum, and their particular personalities are such that they're endlessly curious, true scholars. Raphael Bernstein studied art history for a long time, damn near got a PhD, I believe, and their approach to the content of art is very near and dear to our heart. So as they put together a photography collection, it became clear that the questions that they brought to their photography collecting were those that we liked to use in our teaching. So I hope I've demonstrated today that pictures of the woods, right? I mean, essentially landscapes, like what is the landscape? It's a picture of woods or something, are incredibly complicated. In the context of a teaching museum, these works of art offer us kind of unending opportunities to engage people across campus, whether it's the English department and talking about visual allusion. How does allusion work in a visual object? And how is that parallel to photography? How does it, like in a poem, I might say blood orange. And in a photograph, you might see a blood orange. So how are those parallel? How does the language version change from the image version? So we have those conversations with English. We might have people from the geology department talking about the stone functions and art history, relating it to the Romantic period, or as I said, the subjective photography movement of post World War II. I think that's how it came to be. I will say the series of shows is called A Legacy for Learning. And it's because these different parts of the collection, which are broad, this fall you will see Inuit art, portrait photography, and traditional Japanese scroll painting, all from this same collection. And it's broad and all over, but all of it is brilliant for teaching and learning with. Okay, so I see we haven't.
Thank you. Yes, could you give us a sense, some of the older images that you shared with us, how much have the tones or the colors been impacted by fading?
Yeah, an excellent question. The black and white gelatin silver prints are holding up very well. First of all, as a museum and as collectors, they don't keep them. So the collectors never kept them on view all the time. They were stored, and as a rule of thumb, you show them for 3 months every 3 years. The sun won't get to them as bad. The earliest photographs are really going to be in the next show, which are the portrait shows. And those are cartes de visite, and those have some fading on them, but they're actually, the gelatin silver technique was pretty resilient. The works we worry about are those early color photographs, like the Stephen Shore. Those colors shift and fade throughout the life of chemical color photography. So as long as the color photographs were the old chemical processes, they are susceptible to fading and color shifting. The newer color processes, which were at first much derided, but are now, I'd say 98% of the world of photography has thoroughly accepted digital photographs, digital prints. They offer very permanent inks in the process of making a print. And so whereas a typical C print might well last on full view, might well last in sun for 50 years, these digital prints are expected to last in similar circumstances for 400 or 500 years because the inks are more or less permanent. So the color photographs I worry about, the black and whites not so much in terms of fading. It kind of asks another question though, which is not fading, but the differences between black and white photographs, because this world of black and white photography is actually quite large. It includes things like platinum prints, which are really gray and much more silvery, frankly, than a gelatin silver print, which tends to be black and white. There are sepia versions. there are gold tinted versions. So there's a lot of range, but basically what we mean when we say black and white is we're talking about two-tone, and the range from a very light tone to a very dark tone in the same hue. But we do definitely have to worry about photographs and not put them on view all the time.
Wonderful, thank you. We have an observation. If you look back to the first two, the paintings I think you showed in the very photographs you showed in the very beginning, I think it was the first slide.
Mm-hmm.
We have an observation that the perspective is almost spooky, and that the second image looks like it almost took its form from the first.
Huh. No, can you see it, Sharon? Am I successfully sharing?
Yes, yes. Okay. This is the correct person asking the question. I'm sorry. These are the images you're referring to. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
Okay. Wait, how did I get back there? Here I was thinking I was being so tech savvy. Okay, anyhow, I can get there this way too. But yeah, the question is, these two paintings are kind of eerie. I mean, I have to confess, I chose them deliberately because they had some compositional similarities, and yet they ended up feeling so different. So yeah, you've got a mountain and a valley, but in one you've got this bucolic lake, and the other you've got this really messy tannery. And so I chose those deliberately because it seemed to make it clear, and I think a lot of us are really comfortable with this idea that painters choose every single thing in their composition. If they didn't paint it, it's not there. Whereas photographers have to hunt and peck and choose what they do. But it doesn't mean that they're not composing those. It doesn't mean they're not choosing a high angle or a low angle. So I was trying to get at that with these paintings deliberately for those purposes. And thank you for realizing that. When I was trained back in the 16th century, no, I'm teasing, but when I was trained in art history, we tried to do comparisons because you learn a lot from looking back and forth at two different things. So in a good comparison, you have a lot of similarities and then significant differences to make the point. So yes, two beautiful landscapes, possibly both in the Catskills. We don't really know where the painting was done, but I like to believe it was done in the Catskills. So not too far from the Hudson River Valley, but very different goals for the painters, just as there are very different goals for the photographers.
John, looking at some of the color photographs that are dye transfers.
Oh yeah.
Are you able to explain what is the process? What does that mean that they're a dye transfer?
So yeah, dye transfer prints are unfairly maligned by me just now. Dye transfer prints are actually very hardy. Dye transfer prints were a precursor to digital prints in that they used permanent dyes rather than chemical processes to make the photograph. So what was unstable was the chemistry of color photography. But in dye transfer printing, which was a very complicated and elaborate process, you made a really hardy print. So a lot of color photographers did have their work transferred into dye transfer prints because museums were beginning to bulk. You know, people were saying to you know, Eggleston and Stephen Shore and others, like, you know, we love your work, but we don't want to buy a photograph that's got a 30-year lifetime to it and then it's going to be all purple. And so photographers turned to dye transfer prints as an early process to make them much more permanent. And it worked. You know, collectors felt much more comfortable collecting a dye transfer print than a C print. And I think it really helped preserve a lot of color photography, which was going to go by the wayside. And saving color photography of, you know, like 1970s vintage photography now means freezing the negatives and refrigerating the prints quite cold so that they don't change, so that they slow down that chemical process, which is basically eroding the imagery.
I think we have time for one last question. We have a question that begins with, there is a framework in environmental health called One Health, which reflects relationships between animal health, human health, and the health of the environment. Do you see photographs that encompass this concept as well?
Yes, actually, the Hood is actively trying to create a collection of environmental photography. And one of the places where we've seen some really interesting work, as you're describing it, it's not described the same way, is in contemporary Native American photography. And some of these photographers, and I'll specifically cite Cara Romero right now, are trying to look at healing and human relationship to nature as a metaphor for healing in human relationships with humans, and humans' relationship with animals, and human relationships with humans. So as an overlap between our interest in environmental photography and Native American photography, we've actually found some wonderful examples of that. And I'm sure that there's many more that we haven't yet collected. Frankly, I think it's very important work, and a lot of our engaged photographers today, photographers who are engaged in social concern, are turning away from, not turning away from, but are adding a deep concern for the state of the environment to the repertoire of what they're talking about. Like we're accustomed to seeing social concern photographs of war scenes, socially concerned photographs of people who are homeless, let's say, and living in a city, or the dried out farm that can't grow any plants because of a drought. And this is really expanding into this idea of, I hadn't heard that term, but the concept is absolutely important in contemporary photography. There is, in fact, a catalog for all of these shows that will be available after we open on August 4th. It'll be available at local bookstores that chronicle all of the exhibitions in this series of exhibitions. And I'm so sorry about the pandemic. It wreaked havoc on our scheduling, and we kept changing when we thought we were going to be open. And most recently, we thought we were going to be open in July, and now it turns out that we won't be open until August. I do profoundly apologize that not everybody can see the shows that are currently up at the Hood, but when we open on August 4th, we will be a dynamic, full museum. We've got tons of exhibitions planned, every reason in the world to come visit us at that point.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you everyone for coming today. Just to remind you, I did put in the chat, there is a link to the Hood's YouTube channel, and you can be sure to check back there in a few days to find this recording, as well as many, many others. And we look forward to seeing you again in the near future.
Bye, folks. Thank you again for joining. It was great to have you online.